In 1900, a Siberian hunter named Semyon Tarabikin was tracking game through the permafrost near the Berezovka River when his dogs started acting strange, frantic, terrified. He followed them to a riverbank where the frozen earth had collapsed, and there, jutting out of the ice like something from a nightmare, was a massive, curved tusk. He had found something the world had never seen before, a woolly mammoth, frozen whole, still in its skin. Word reached the Russian Imperial Academy of Sciences, and they immediately dispatched a full expedition. When the scientists arrived and began to excavate, what they found stopped them cold. The animal had food still in its mouth, unswallowed. Grasses and buttercups, plants that still grew in the region today, perfectly preserved between its teeth. Its muscles were still red, still intact. The smell was overwhelming, but the animal itself was undeniably impossibly whole. That was not a fossil. That was a mammoth that looked like it had died last week, and it had been frozen in the Siberian ice for over 10,000 years. The scientific world erupted. Here was an animal that had lived alongside early humans, an animal that had roamed the same landscapes where we built our first cities, painted our first cave walls, and learned to make fire. And here it was, preserved so perfectly that scientists could examine its last meal. It raised an immediate and terrifying question. How does an animal that large, in a world that cold, simply stop existing? That question would take over a century to answer. And the answer, when it came, was more complicated and more chilling than anyone expected. Before we go further, let's get something straight. The woolly mammoth is not the elephant's ancient ancestor. It is the elephant's cousin, a close one. Mammoths and modern Asian elephants share about 99.6% of their DNA. They diverged from a common ancestor roughly 6 million years ago, splitting into two separate lineages that evolved in completely different directions. Elephants went south, adapting to warm, tropical climates. Mammoths went north into the cold, and cold shaped everything about them. The woolly mammoth, Mammothus primigenius, was built for a world of ice. Its coat was extraordinary, a dense, woolly undercoat several inches thick, covered by long, coarse outer guard hairs that could reach up to 3 feet in length. Beneath that, a layer of fat up to 4 inches thick provided insulation against temperatures that dropped to -50 degrees Celsius. Their ears were tiny compared to modern elephants. Less surface area meant less heat loss. Their tails were short for the same reason, but the most iconic feature was the tusks. Woolly mammoths had tusks that could grow over 13 feet long in large adult males, curving dramatically outward and then twisting back inward. For a long time, scientists debated what these tusks were actually for. The answer turned out to be elegant and practical. Mammoths used them like a snowplow. They would sweep the tusks across the frozen ground to scrape away ice and snow, exposing the dry grasses and sedges underneath. Evidence of this comes directly from wear patterns found on excavated tusks, always on the same side, always the same angle, the same sweeping motion, repeated millions of times over a lifetime. In terms of size, a large male stood about 11 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed up to 6 tons, slightly smaller than today's African elephant, but with proportionally much more mass concentrated in the front, built for cold weather endurance rather than tropical speed. And they were everywhere. At their peak, woolly mammoths ranged across a vast belt of cold steppe, stretching from Western Europe all the way across Siberia, into Alaska, and down through North America. We are talking about one of the most geographically widespread, large mammals that has ever lived. Their fossilized remains have been found on every continent except Australia and Antarctica. They were not rare. They were not fragile. They were one of the most successful large animals on the planet. And then they were gone. To understand the mammoth, you have to understand its world, because the world it lived in was nothing like the Siberia we know today. Between roughly 100,000 and 12,000 years ago, much of the northern hemisphere was covered by what scientists call the Mammoth steppe. It wasn't a tundra. It wasn't a frozen wasteland. It was a vast, productive grassland, cold but rich with vegetation, teeming with life. Think of it like the African Serengeti, but frozen. A cold Serengeti, stretching from Europe to North America across land bridges that no longer exist. The Mammoth steppe supported an extraordinary community of megafauna: woolly rhinos, cave lions, short-faced bears that stood taller than a modern grizzly on all fours, Irish elk with antler spans wider than a car, steppe bison in herds that rivaled the American buffalo, cave hyenas, and at the top, mammoths, huge, slow, socially complex, ecologically essential. Here's something that often gets overlooked. Mammoths weren't just living in that ecosystem. They were actively maintaining it by plowing through snow with their tusks, by knocking down trees and shrubs, by fertilizing the soil with their waste. Mammoths essentially kept the steppe as steppe. They were what ecologists call a keystone species, an animal so central to its environment that without it, the entire ecosystem starts to unravel. When you dig into the soil of modern Siberia, you often find a sharp boundary layer in the sediment. Below that boundary, grassland species, mammoth bones, a rich, productive ecosystem. Above that boundary, the soggy, moss-covered permafrost we see today. That boundary marks the moment the mammoths disappeared. And when they went, the landscape literally transformed around their absence. The mammoth didn't just live in its world, it was holding that world together. Mammoths weren't predators, they were grazers, but the question of how they fed, moved, and organized their lives is just as fascinating as any predator's hunting strategy. Because what the fossils reveal is an animal of startling intelligence and social depth. Mammoth herds were matriarchal, structured almost identically to modern elephant herds. A dominant older female led the group, and her knowledge of migration routes, water sources, safe calving grounds was the difference between survival and death. Young males would eventually leave the herd, living in bachelor groups or solitary ranges. Old bulls, like modern elephant bulls, showed evidence of musth, a state of elevated testosterone and heightened aggression that drove competition for mates. We know this not from guesswork, but from tusk analysis. Tusks grow continuously throughout a mammoth's life, and like tree rings, each layer of tusk records the conditions of that year. Scientists can read a mammoth's entire life history in cross-sections of its tusks. Periods of drought, periods of plenty, the stress of pregnancy, the onset of musth. It is one of the most detailed biological records we have from any prehistoric animal. What did they eat? Primarily grasses, sedges, and herbaceous plants. Pollen analysis from frozen mammoth stomach contents shows a diet surprisingly diverse for a cold climate animal. Over 200 plant species identified in some individuals. They needed to consume enormous quantities to sustain their mass. Estimates suggest a large mammoth needed to eat between 180 and 400 pounds of vegetation per day. That meant spending most of their waking hours feeding, roughly 20 hours a day in winter when food was scarce. Their famous curved tusks also served social functions. Males used them in sparring and dominance displays. Locked tusk marks have been found on mammoth skulls, evidence of battles that would have shaken the frozen ground for miles. These were not dumb, lumbering beasts. They were intelligent, social, emotionally complex animals navigating a harsh world with the same sophistication elephants show today, which makes what happened next all the more haunting. Around 10,000 years ago, something terrible happened to the large animals of the world. Not just mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave lions, giant ground sloths, short-faced bears, horses in North America, camels in North America, the Irish elk. Over 50 genera of large mammals disappeared in what geologists call the Quaternary extinction event, one of the most dramatic die-offs in the last 66 million years. And the debate about why has raged for 150 years. There are two main suspects: climate change and humans. The climate case is compelling. Right around 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, the last ice age ended. Temperatures rose rapidly. The great grasslands of the Mammoth steppe began to transform. In Siberia, the permafrost thawed from the top down, turning productive steppe into waterlogged, boggy tundra that couldn't support the dense herds of grazers. The cold, dry grasslands that mammoths needed to survive were literally disappearing beneath their feet. But here's where it gets complicated. Mammoths had survived previous warming periods, multiple ones. The Pleistocene is defined by cycles of glacial advance and retreat, ice ages followed by warm interglacials over and over for 2.6 million years. Mammoths had lived through all of them. They were not strangers to climate change. So why this time did they vanish? Enter the second suspect: humans. Modern humans spread out of Africa roughly 70,000 years ago and began arriving in mammoth territory in waves. Into Europe around 45,000 years ago. Into Siberia, and then across the Bering Land Bridge into North America by around 15,000 years ago. And wherever humans arrived, the megafauna disappeared shortly after. The timing is brutal. In Australia, giant marsupials vanished within a few thousand years of human arrival. In the Americas, 34 genera of large mammals disappeared in a pulse that tracks almost perfectly with the human colonization front moving south through the continent. Paul Martin, the paleontologist who developed this idea, called it the overkill hypothesis. The argument is stark. These animals had never encountered a predator that hunted with projectile weapons, that cooperated in large groups, that could follow herds across continents. They had no fear of humans. They were, in the language of conservation biology, ecologically naive. Easy prey. A single mammoth, if killed, could feed a band of hunters for weeks. And a band of hunters didn't need to kill many mammoths per year to push a slow reproducing species over the edge. The truth, most researchers now believe, was both. Climate change shrank the habitats. Humans finished the job. Neither alone was sufficient. Together, they were lethal. The mammoths were caught in a vice, their world shrinking from below, their numbers cut from above, with no room to retreat and no time to adapt. The last woolly mammoths on Earth did not live in Siberia. They lived on Wrangel Island, a small island in the Arctic Ocean off the northeastern coast of Russia. Isolated from humans, they survived there in a dwindling population for thousands of years after the mainland populations had gone. The last confirmed Wrangel Island mammoths died approximately 3,700 years ago. That is not ancient history. The Great Pyramid of Giza was already 800 years old when the last woolly mammoth died. Here's what makes the woolly mammoth unlike almost any other extinct animal. We don't just have its bones, we have its body. More than 40 frozen mammoth specimens have been recovered from the Siberian and Alaskan permafrost, many of them extraordinarily well preserved. The Berezovka mammoth found in 1900. Dima, a baby mammoth discovered in 1977, so perfectly preserved that its eyelashes were still intact. Yuka, a young female found in 2010, with her coat still in place and her brain still present inside her skull. From these specimens, scientists have been able to learn things about mammoths that would be impossible from bones alone. Their blood, for instance, had a special adaptation that allowed it to release oxygen more efficiently in cold temperatures, a genetic modification that prevented it from seizing up in extreme cold. Their hemoglobin was different from a modern elephant's in 3 specific ways, all of which made it function better at low temperatures. We know this because we have sequenced the woolly mammoth genome completely. The woolly mammoth genome, published in full in 2015, is one of the most complete ancient genomes ever assembled, and what it revealed was astonishing. The mammoth's cold-adapted traits, its thick fat layer, its heat-conserving physiology, its specialized hair follicles, were controlled by a surprisingly small number of genetic changes from the Asian elephant baseline. Evolution had accomplished an extraordinary transformation with relatively few tweaks. That fact would turn out to be very important, because some scientists looked at that genome, looked at how few changes separated a mammoth from a living elephant, and asked a question that would have seemed like science fiction just 20 years ago. What if we could bring it back? In 2021, a company called Colossal Biosciences was founded with a single-stated mission: resurrect the woolly mammoth. Not a replica, not a museum exhibit, a living, breathing, cold-adapted elephant that could walk on the Siberian tundra and begin restoring the mammoth steppe ecosystem. The science behind this is not pure fantasy. It begins with CRISPR, the gene editing technology that allows scientists to make precise changes to DNA. The plan is to take the Asian elephant genome, identify the specific genes responsible for mammoth cold adaptations using the sequenced mammoth genome as a guide, and edit those genes into elephant cells. Then, using artificial wombs or surrogate elephants, gestate a living animal carrying those traits. Colossal's lead scientist, George Church of Harvard, and his team have already made significant progress. By 2023, they had successfully identified and edited multiple mammoth-specific genes into elephant cell lines, including genes controlling fat metabolism, cold-sensing hair follicles, and the hemoglobin modifications we know mammoths carried. The cells are alive. The edits are working in laboratory conditions. But here's what's important to understand. What they would produce would not be a woolly mammoth. It would be something new. A cold-adapted Asian elephant carrying mammoth traits. Call it a mammophant if you want. It would look similar, behave similarly, carry the ecological function of a mammoth, but it would not be the animal that was chewing buttercups on the Berezovka riverbank 10,000 years ago. The ecological argument for doing this is serious. Sergei Zimov, a Russian scientist, has spent decades running an experiment called Pleistocene Park in Siberia, reintroducing large grazing animals to tundra to see if the mammoth steppe can be restored. His results suggest that large herbivores do indeed compact snow, allow the ground to freeze deeper in winter, and slow the thawing of permafrost. The permafrost of Siberia contains an estimated 1.5 trillion tons of frozen carbon. If it thaws, it releases into the atmosphere as methane and CO2, dramatically accelerating global warming. Mammoths, in other words, might be a partial solution to climate change. The very animal that was killed partly by climate change could now be recruited to fight it. the ethics are tangled and contested, creating an animal that will exist in a world its original form never faced. The welfare of the elephant surrogates, the ecological risks of introducing a new mega-herbivore at scale. These are real questions without easy answers. Scientists, ethicists, and conservationists are still arguing them out, but the technology is moving faster than the debate. Colossal projects, their first elephant-mammoth hybrid calves, could be possible within the next decade. A small herd, reintroduced to the Siberian tundra within 20 to 30 years, is their stated goal. Think about that. The woolly mammoth is many things at once. It is a ghost, a specimen, a warning, and now, perhaps, a second chance. Its extinction tells us something brutally clear about the world, that large, successful, socially complex animals can be erased in geological eye blinks, that the combination of habitat loss and human pressure is a formula that the megafauna of the Pleistocene could not survive, and that the megafauna of today are still fighting against. We are living in the sixth mass extinction event in Earth's history. The current rate of species loss rivals the event that killed the dinosaurs. And unlike those 5 previous mass extinctions, caused by asteroids, volcanic eruptions, oxygen depletion, this one has a single cause: us. The mammoth didn't disappear because it was weak. It disappeared because the world changed faster than it could adapt, and because a new kind of intelligence arrived that it had no evolutionary preparation for. It was simply outpaced, and so the mammoth becomes a mirror. In it, we see not just an animal, but a reflection of our own power and our own responsibility. We have the ability to drive species to extinction. It turns out we may also be developing the ability to undo it. Whether we should is a question humanity is only beginning to ask. But here's what I keep coming back to. 10,000 years ago, somewhere on the Siberian steppe, the last mainland mammoth walked through a snow-covered landscape that was growing less and less able to support it. It did not know what was happening. It did not know it was the last. It was just an animal doing what animals do, looking for food, following the herd, surviving one more day. And it has been waiting in the ice ever since, perfectly preserved, almost patient. Maybe that patience is about to be rewarded.